My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I'm here with Neil Augenstein, reporter and producer of the podcast, The Investigation Continues. We're here because we are at the last episode, episode 5 of The Investigation Continues, which explores the 40-year-old case of the missing Lyon sisters in Montgomery County. And Neil is here to talk about the fifth episode as well as the case itself and entertain any of your questions and discussion regarding the 5-episode podcast, which can be heard on WTOP by searching investigation on our homepage. Neil?
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, in episode 5, there is finally an arrest and an indictment in the murders of Sheila and Catherine Lyon. About 18 months after Lloyd Lee Welch was named a person of interest, he was finally indicted. He was not indicted in Montgomery County, Maryland, where the girls disappeared. He was indicted 210 miles away in a small county called Bedford County, Virginia. And it is there that investigators believe that the bodies of 12-year-old Sheila and 10-year-old Catherine Lyon ended up. In the Investigation Continues episode 5, we learn about what prosecutors said was a conspiracy. And in this conspiracy, we learn that the girls' bodies were brought to a remote property in Thaxton, Virginia. I traveled down there a few weeks ago as I was preparing for the podcast. And there's a beautiful piece of the country called Taylor's Mountain, and there's on Taylor Mountain Road there's a home there that police and investigators believe that the bodies of the girls were taken. What police now believe is that Lloyd Welch showed up there unannounced in 1975 to a family-owned property, a cousin, I believe. There was a woman by the name of Connie Akers who lived in the home at the time, and her mother was Lizzie Akers. Lizzie Akers was the sister of a man who is Lloyd Welch's uncle, whose name is Richard Welch. And at the time, in 1975, Richard Welch lived in Kensington, right near Lloyd Lee Welch. Now, what Connie Akers told investigators is that Lloyd Welch arrived unannounced in a station wagon on Taylor's Mountain. What he had with him was a duffel bag that had bloody clothes in it. And according to prosecutors, Lloyd Welch asked Connie to wash the bag. He said that he had been carrying around some raw hamburger meat, and it had spoiled. She refused to wash it. Her brother, whose name is Henry Parker, also told investigators down there that he remembered that time when Lloyd Welch showed up there. And he said that Lloyd Welch had with him 2 large green Army duffel bags. And he said each of them weighed about 70 to 80 pounds. He said that they were covered in blood. And he said that in his words, they smelled of death. According to charging documents and according to the indictment, Henry Parker knew at the time, allegedly, that Lloyd Welch had 2 girls with him and that he was running from the law. Parker apparently told investigators that he helped Lloyd Welch toss those duffel bags on a fire that was burning on the property. a fire that burned for several days. And they didn't report it back then, but in 2014, when after Lloyd Lee Welch had been named a person of interest in the case, several people who lived on Taylor Mountain could still remember the smell that hung over the mountain in 1975, and they described it as the smell of cremation. So that is the conspiracy that investigators believe Lloyd Lee Welch was involved in. They also named a person of interest. They named Richard Welch, Lloyd Lee Welch's uncle, as a person of interest. They said that Lloyd Welch had told investigators that Richard Welch and he had taken the girls from the mall with the motive of exploiting them sexually, and Lloyd Welch told investigators, according to charging documents, that he witnessed Richard Welch sexually abusing one of the Lyon sisters in Richard Welch's basement soon after the disappearance. Now, I have talked with Richard Welch's daughter, Patricia Ann, talked with her several times. She has always said that her father had nothing to do with it. Even though he is still a person of interest, he has never been charged. There's no indication that he will be charged. Police have not provided any information to suggest that he will be charged, but his name is out there. And Patricia Welch says that she believes that Lloyd Lee Welch killed the girls and he abused them because, as you remember from last episode, Welch has a history of abusing young girls, and that's what he was serving 29 years in prison for when Montgomery County police detectives began interviewing him as the person of interest in the disappearance of the Lyon sisters. So that's sort of where we stand in the podcast right now.
Okay, I have a couple questions. One, why? I mean, is there any explanation as to why nobody had come forward when they did, see some of these unusual things like the bloody bag or smell the fire? Who was this guy who allegedly helped him put this bloody bag on the fire? I mean, is there any...
Well, the prosecutors have said it certainly is noteworthy that it took a grand jury investigation and 40 years for people who lived on Taylor Mountain to tell anybody about this. Of course, it is possible that they did tell somebody back then.
Right.
I'm not aware of any sort of investigation that was done at the time. I mean, this is beautiful but remote country, and I think that I think people have privacy there, and there's also a sort of a community, a shared community. I know that there's a Facebook page of people who or descendants of people who live on Taylor's Mountain. So that, apparently there's a long, great history of people who live there. But for whatever reason, nobody apparently described the smell of cremation back then. I think that there are some members, I know that Patricia Welch, who I've talked with, whose father has been very publicly named, although, again, has not been charged. His name is out there, but she is angry that nobody ever told what they knew until Lloyd Welch was named a person of interest. And she's quite concerned and that there was a cover-up, or at least people turning a blind eye for many decades, and just isn't happy about that.
Now remind me again, who is the guy that has pointed the finger at Richard Welch, who said he saw this happen in the basement?
Well, Lloyd Lee Welch,
Oh,
the person who's charged with murder, is a person who did that. There is somebody else, and I don't want to say his name because I'm not sure of it. I believe that there is another family member who described some sort of being aware of some sort of incident involving Lloyd Lee Welch's uncle. And I don't know whether he was a witness or he just heard about it or what. But that's but again, police have not charged Richard Welch with anything, and again, it's not clear whether they ever will. They certainly haven't cleared him, and I think that 2 years after he's been named as a person of interest, I think some would say that it's time for investigators to either charge or clear his name.
So back to the fire, the burning of the duffel bag. Since any evidence that might be presumed in this case was burned up, how does that weaken the case against Lloyd Lee Welch when he goes to trial?
It's not, remember, Lloyd Lee Welch is charged with felony murder of both of the Lyon sisters, although their bodies have never been recovered. What investigators have indicated in court records, there is a gag order, so I'm not able to talk with prosecutors or police about any evidence or any motives that they may have. But by looking at court records, I see that a tooth was recovered on Taylor's Mountain, and investigators also have dental records. They don't indicate whether those dental records belong to one of the Lyon sisters. I would venture to say it wouldn't be in this this evidence folder if it weren't.
So
and prosecutors have also said that they will likely call as an expert witness an archaeologist who can testify about bones found on the property. Now, to compound and confuse the matter even more, there was a graveyard, a family graveyard on the property, which is not uncommon there on the mountain. But the investigators, it remains to be seen, and I can't tell from the records whether investigators believe that any of the bones that they found belong to anybody besides the person under whose gravestone they were buried.
Wow. And I can imagine 40 years after this event, this fire, that the property had been grown over, that it was probably difficult for investigators to find anything.
Well, even within the last few weeks, there have been more searches at the property in Taylor Mountain. The FBI and the local sheriff's department have gone back there and continue to search for more evidence in the case.
Now, so the trial is in September, and you'll be covering the trial.
Right.
Do we know anything about the parents of Sheila and Catherine Lyon and how they're handling all of these headlines, your podcast, just the anticipation of a grueling trial where all these memories are going to be dredged up?
Right. Well, before the podcast posted, before the first episode posted, I wanted to make sure that the Lyon family knew about it. I did ask a couple of people who were family friends to let the Lyon family know that we were doing the podcast. The Lyon family has requested privacy over the years, and I made the decision to not personally intrude upon them beforehand, but I wanted them to know that the podcast was going to be done. I sent them all 5 episodes of the podcast before the first one posted because I didn't want them to be surprised by anything that they might hear. Although I knew that they knew everything that the prosecutors and the defense had said up to this point, and likely a lot more. I will say I was very pleased to get a very kind email from John Lyon, the father of the girls, as well as one of the brothers of the Lyon sisters. And they both thanked me for sharing the podcast ahead of time. They both said that it was accurate in their opinion, and they appreciated that people still cared about the case. I will tell you personally that was a relief to me because it's such a this case, of course, by its nature, is a personal invasion of the family, the family's privacy. Even though it is one of the most infamous cases, unsolved cases that our area has ever known, and it will continue to be, all aspects of it will continue to be covered. I wanted to make sure that it had the sensitivity that it deserved. So I'm sure that the Lyon family will be there for the trial when it happens. It's due to happen in September. I would not be surprised if there were a plea bargain leading up to it. I have nothing to back that up. It just seems that since the death penalty is still on the table, a willingness to plead guilty to take the death penalty off the table would be something that many defendants would take.
Yeah. Wow. Well, there's certainly been a lot of response here at WTOP about your podcast. And one of the things, though, if we could say it was a more negative response, was some people had tweeted in at various times saying, well, why pay attention to this case when you have so many other missing children or missing or murdered children cases throughout the country and even in Virginia and D.C. and Maryland? Can you tell us a little bit about why you did the podcast and why you feel it's important for readers and listeners to know about this case and how it might conclude with the trial?
Well, I think that it's certainly a fair question, and unfortunately there are a lot of missing children and unsolved cases. This particular one from 1975 transfixed this area. It was the first high-profile disappearance of a child or any children in this area, and it really changed the way that people lived around here. Back then, it was a lot harder to solve a missing person's case than it is now. There weren't a lot of the resources that there are. I will also say, and this comes from talking with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that thankfully the number of missing children is quite low. Was then and remains. And thankfully, a lot of the cases of missing children are only temporary, and that at least in the D.C. area, the police chief has said recently that 95% of the children who are reported as missing ultimately are reunited and left on their own volition. Of course, that does raise an entire new story for research on why the children would leave, but that will be for another podcast, another episode. I think that people who've lived around here for any period of time are exhausted, mystified, repulsed, engrossed by the story of 2 young girls who went to the mall and never came home. And I think that any person who's now a parent can thank God that it's not their kids. And I think that that's the reason why I did the story.
Well, we thank you for doing such a sensitive job. I think getting those emails from the father and the brother are a testament or a reassurance to you that you were on the right track and had reported and delivered it in a way where it wasn't exploitive but informational. And I look forward to your reporting throughout the trial period.
And
as well.
just to remind people that you can subscribe to the Investigation Continues podcast. You can find links on our page. You can also subscribe from iTunes or Podcast One or any place that you normally listen to podcasts. That way, since this is the fifth and final episode, the one that was posted on Monday, we will have future episodes, and you will get a notification in your podcast app when we update the story. And I expect to do that when there are major developments in the story, if court records reveal any new information, if there happened to be a plea, or if the case eventually went to trial. We will, if you're subscribing, then you won't miss a thing.
Thank you, Neil, and thanks for joining us on WTOP, WTOP.com, Washington.